James or England? Sean Bean, method acting or just plain mean? The scene, 1995, the set of GoldenEye, Pierce Brosnan's triumphant debut as 007 was meant to be his moment of glory, a chance to prove himself as the new face of the most iconic franchise in cinema history. But one man seemed determined to overshadow him at every turn. The inciting incident came during rehearsals for their climactic fight scene atop the massive satellite dish. Bean, a notorious method actor, reportedly refused to break character between takes, maintaining the cold hostility of the traitorous 006, even when cameras stopped rolling. Sean would stare at me with genuine contempt, a crew member overheard Brosnan confiding to director Martin Campbell. It's like he's not acting at all. What Brosnan felt but couldn't express publicly was a simmering frustration. Here he was, carrying the weight of an entire franchise on his shoulders, while Bean seemed intent on turning their professional relationship into a genuine rivalry. There are two types of actors, Brosnan would later reflect, carefully choosing his words. Those who support their colleagues and those who see every scene as a competition. The implication was crystal clear to industry insiders. The tension escalated during promotional interviews when Bean repeatedly emphasized how his character was Bond's equal, a subtle undermining of Brosnan's authority as the film's star. But the true betrayal came years later when Bean publicly dismissed Brosnan's entire era as Bond. There was a slickness to that era that perhaps didn't serve the character well, Bean told Empire magazine in 2012, seemingly forgetting that GoldenEye had saved the franchise after a 6-year hiatus. For Brosnan, this wasn't just professional criticism. It was a personal attack on his legacy, the legacy he had carefully built over 4 films, only to have it casually dismissed by a man who had shared in its creation. They never worked together again. When asked years later about a potential reunion with Bean, Brosnan's response spoke volumes. Some partnerships work once and only once. The gentleman had spoken. The door was closed. And that was just the beginning of Brosnan's hidden list of Hollywood grudges. He was pounding the table, saying, "You are the best James Bond. I want to do James Bond with you. And it's very close quarters in the restaurant." I said, "Quentin, please calm down. Calm down." But you don't tell Quentin Tarantino to calm down. Quentin Tarantino, the director who hijacked his legacy. It was supposed to be a simple dinner, a meeting of creative minds. But for Pierce Brosnan, his 1997 encounter with Quentin Tarantino would become one of the most uncomfortable moments of his career and the beginning of a grudge that has lasted decades. The incident began at a restaurant in Hollywood. Tarantino, riding high after Pulp Fiction, approached Brosnan's table uninvited, martini in hand. What followed was a bizarre, alcohol-fueled monologue about how Tarantino wanted to direct Brosnan in Casino Royale. He was pounding the table, Brosnan recounted, his discomfort still evident years later, loudly proclaiming I was the best Bond and how we needed to work together to save the franchise. For Brosnan, who had just weathered the critical mixed reaction to Tomorrow Never Dies, Tarantino's theatrical display was both embarrassing and professionally awkward. But the real betrayal was yet to come. When the Bond producers predictably rejected Tarantino's pitch, the director didn't maintain Hollywood's code of discretion. Instead, he went public, declaring to anyone who would listen that the Bond franchise was too afraid to work with him. This created immediate tension between Brosnan and the producers, who suspected the actor had encouraged Tarantino's approach. "Suddenly, I was defending myself to the very people who controlled my career," Brosnan admitted. "It was humiliating." But Tarantino wasn't finished. As years passed, his praise for Brosnan mysteriously transformed into dismissal. In a 2009 interview, Tarantino declared Timothy Dalton the most underrated Bond and later called Brosnan's interpretation the least interesting. The about-face left Brosnan stunned. "You expect criticism in this business," Brosnan reflected, his voice tightening. "What you don't expect is to be used as a publicity pawn in someone else's game." For Brosnan, Tarantino represented everything toxic about Hollywood: the grandstanding, the public betrayals, the casual rewriting of history to suit personal narratives. When asked recently if he would ever consider working with Tarantino, Brosnan's response was tellingly brief: "I believe that ship has sailed." And as the years passed, Brosnan's list of grievances continued to grow, along with his determination to maintain his dignity in an industry that seemed intent on stripping it away. But not all of Brosnan's enemies wore tuxedos or sat in directors' chairs. One nearly destroyed his reputation with a single interview. And another, well, let's just say Bond would have drawn his Walther PPK. "I don't know if I helped Daniel make up his mind. Daniel is his own man, really." Daniel Craig, the replacement who didn't just take his job, he erased him. When Daniel Craig stepped into the iconic tuxedo in 2006, it wasn't just a casting change. For Pierce Brosnan, it felt like an erasure of his entire legacy. The wound began with that fateful phone call, but it deepened with every interview, every press conference, every carefully crafted statement about how Casino Royale would reinvent Bond. The subtext was brutal in its clarity. Everything Brosnan had built needed to be dismantled. It wasn't just that they replaced me, Brosnan confided to a close friend. It was that they seemed determined to make everyone forget me. When Craig's Casino Royale was released to critical acclaim, the narrative became even more painful. Reviewers praised the film as the Bond we've been waiting for and a necessary correction after years of excess, thinly veiled criticisms of Brosnan's tenure. Initially, Brosnan maintained his legendary composure, publicly supporting Craig and wishing him well, but privately he was seething. "I wanted Bond to evolve," Brosnan later revealed. "I pushed for darker stories, more emotional depth. I was always told that's not what Bond is about, Pierce." Watching Craig receive accolades for the very approach he had been denied left Brosnan feeling his contributions had been not just dismissed, but actively buried. The betrayal cut deeper when Craig himself seemed to join the chorus, telling an interviewer that Bond had become a parody of itself before his arrival, a statement that felt like a direct attack on Brosnan's interpretation. "You'd think he could show some respect," Brosnan reportedly told a Casino Royale crew member who had worked on his Bond films. "I left him a franchise. I didn't leave him a mess." When Brosnan finally watched Casino Royale, his review was pointed. "It's a very hard, cold movie. I felt it lacked heart." Later, he described Craig as looking like a brick wall, professional criticism that barely concealed personal resentment. As Craig's era continued, Brosnan maintained a public politeness that grew increasingly strained. When asked for advice for Craig, his response was telling in its brevity, "Just enjoy it, man." What Brosnan never said publicly, but confided to close friends, was that Craig's success felt like a repudiation of everything he had contributed to the character. Daniel Craig didn't just replace him, he erased him. And for a proud actor who had revitalized Bond after a 6-year absence, who had brought the franchise into the modern era and delivered its first billion-dollar film with GoldenEye, that erasure was something he could never forgive. It was only a matter of time before Brosnan snapped. And for those who knew him well, the only question was who would push him over the edge. Jinx, you say, born on Friday the 13th. You believe in bad luck. Halle Berry, the co-star who stabbed him in the back. The pairing seemed perfect on paper. Pierce Brosnan in his final outing as Bond alongside Oscar winner Halle Berry as Jinx, an NSA agent who was his equal in every way. Die Another Day was meant to be Brosnan's triumphant farewell to the role that had defined his career. Instead, it became one of his deepest professional wounds. The tension began subtly on set. Berry, fresh from her historic Oscar win for Monsters Ball, reportedly found the Bond formula restricting. According to crew members, she frequently questioned scenes and pushed for changes that would elevate her character, sometimes at the expense of Brosnan's. There was a constant renegotiation of power, one production assistant recalled. Pierce was always professional, but you could see it wearing on him. Still, Brosnan maintained a united front during promotion, praising Berry as a wonderful partner and supporting rumors of a Jinx spin-off film. The betrayal came later, after the Bond producers had unceremoniously dismissed Brosnan when he was at his most vulnerable professionally. In a 2007 interview, Berry was asked about Die Another Day and responded with surprising candor. "Let's be honest, it was a lot, maybe too much." When the interviewer specifically mentioned the invisible car and CGI parasailing sequence, Berry laughed and added, "All of it. It was just campy." For Brosnan, who learned of these comments while struggling to redefine his post-Bond career, the timing couldn't have been worse. Die Another Day marked his final appearance as Bond, and Berry's dismissal of the film seemed to diminish his entire legacy. He was hurt, a close friend revealed. He defended her on set, supported her spin-off, and this was how she repaid him. When Berry later attempted to reconnect at an industry event, witnesses described Brosnan as glacially polite, a state one longtime colleague characterized as Pierce at his most angry. Years later, when asked about potential co-stars he'd like to work with again, Berry's name was conspicuously absent from Brosnan's list. What Brosnan didn't say spoke volumes louder than what he did. The betrayal by Berry left Brosnan increasingly guarded, increasingly selective about who he would trust with his professional reputation. But one rivalry was brewing that had nothing to do with Bond at all, a tension between two British actors who represented entirely different visions of masculinity. Hugh Grant, the anti-Bond rivalry that nobody saw coming. They seemed to occupy entirely different corners of British cinema. Brosnan, the suave international spy, Grant, the stammering romantic lead. Yet behind the scenes brewed one of Hollywood's most unexpected rivalries. The tension began innocently enough in 1996. As Brosnan was cementing his Bond legacy with GoldenEye, Grant was asked in an interview if he would ever consider playing 007. His response, "I'd rather be a corpse than play James Bond," was typical Grant self-deprecation. But to Brosnan, it felt like a direct attack on his career-defining role. According to a former press agent who worked with both actors, Brosnan found Grant insufferably smug, and his constant self-deprecation vapid and calculated. The rivalry intensified in the early 2000s when both actors were considered for several high-profile romantic leads. There was genuine animosity there, the agent revealed. Pace felt Hughes' bumbling Englishman act was just that, an act, and one that had unfairly cornered the market on a certain type of role. The competition came to a head when Grant was cast in Love Actually over Brosnan, a decision that reportedly left Brosnan seething. "Hugh represents a very specific type of Englishness," Brosnan later said, his tone neutral, but his meaning clear to British audiences who understood the class implications. "It's just not an Englishness I particularly relate to." What truly infuriated Brosnan was Grant's continued mockery of the Bond franchise, which he once described as the same film made over and over again. Each dismissive comment felt like a personal slight, a diminishing of the work that had made Brosnan an international star. The rivalry might have remained professional had Grant not crossed a line during a 2005 award ceremony. According to multiple witnesses, an inebriated Grant approached Brosnan and joked, "Ah, the spy who didn't love me enough to stay employed." It was a cruel reference to Brosnan's recent firing from the Bond franchise. Pace just froze, one attendee recalled. Then he turned and walked away without a word. It was chilling. Since that night, Brosnan has reportedly refused to attend any event where Grant is present. When asked about his fellow British actor in interviews, Brosnan offers only the barest professional courtesy before changing the subject. The feud might seem petty from the outside, but for Brosnan, Grant represents everything he resents about British class politics in acting, the way certain backgrounds are celebrated while others are expected to constantly prove their worth. And as Brosnan's list of grudges grew longer, one name would push him to break his legendary composure completely. A line in the sand that would reveal just how far the gentleman spy was willing to go when his core values were threatened. "My team. I'm shaken, not stirred. And for you?" Mel Gibson, the one line Brosnan refused to cross. Some grudges are professional, others are personal, but Pierce Brosnan's rift with Mel Gibson is something else entirely, a moral line in the sand that revealed the true character behind the polished facade. Unlike Brosnan's other Hollywood feuds, his break with Gibson wasn't the result of professional rivalry or wounded pride. It was a principled stand that shocked an industry accustomed to looking the other way. The breaking point came in 2006 after Gibson's infamous anti-Semitic tirade during a DUI arrest. While many in Hollywood hedged their responses or remained silent, Brosnan's reaction was swift and unequivocal. "I won't work with racists or bigots," Brosnan stated when asked about Gibson at a time when most stars were carefully avoiding the topic. According to industry insiders, Brosnan had been approached for a project Gibson was producing and declined immediately upon learning of Gibson's involvement. What made Brosnan's stand particularly notable was its personal foundation. "I grew up in Ireland during the Troubles," Brosnan once explained, his voice carrying rare emotion. "I've seen what happens when people use religion to justify hatred." For Brosnan, whose Irish Catholic background and experiences with religious conflict in Northern Ireland had shaped his worldview, Gibson's behavior wasn't just offensive. It was a triggering reminder of the sectarian violence he had witnessed in his youth. The rift deepened when Gibson began his Hollywood comeback. While many colleagues welcomed him back with open arms, Brosnan maintained his distance. At a 2016 industry event where both were present, witnesses described Brosnan deliberately changing his path to avoid crossing Gibson's. "It wasn't subtle," one attendee noted. "Pace saw Mel approaching and literally turned 180 degrees. The message couldn't have been clearer." When directly asked if he would reconsider working with Gibson now that time had passed, Brosnan's response was resolute. "Some principles aren't negotiable regardless of talent." What makes this stance particularly revealing is how it contrasts with Brosnan's handling of his other Hollywood grudges. With Craig, Bean, Barry, and others, Brosnan maintained at least a veneer of professional courtesy. With Gibson, there was no pretense, no diplomatic evasion, just a clear moral boundary that would not be crossed. For a man known for his restraint, for keeping his true feelings carefully guarded, this uncompromising position offered a rare glimpse of the real Pierce Brosnan, a man whose polished exterior conceals deeply held convictions and a moral code as unshakable as that of the spy he once portrayed. And it's this complexity, the tension between Brosnan's cultivated image and his private resentments, that makes his Hollywood grudges so fascinating. Not just for what they reveal about the film industry, but for what they tell us about the man himself. The price of these grudges. For Brosnan, these long-standing tensions haven't just been emotionally taxing. They've exacted a real professional cost. Hollywood is built on relationships, and each burned bridge represented opportunities lost, collaborations that would never happen, paths not taken. The most obvious consequence came after his Bond dismissal. In an industry that values winners above all else, Brosnan's unceremonious removal from the franchise created a narrative of failure that took years to overcome. While he channeled his complicated feelings into nuanced performances in films like The Matador and The Ghost Writer, the A-list roles he seemed destined for often went elsewhere. Being pushed out of Bond wasn't just painful emotionally, Brosnan admitted years later. It changed how people saw me, how they valued me in this business. Suddenly, I was damaged goods. His refusal to work with certain directors and actors further limited his options. When Gibson was producing Edge of Darkness, Brosnan was reportedly the first choice for the lead, a role that might have significantly altered his post-Bond trajectory. His principled refusal cost him both financially and professionally. Even his stance against Tarantino had consequences. As Tarantino's cultural capital grew throughout the 2000s, Brosnan found himself excluded from the director's circle of influence, a significant liability in an industry where power is constantly shifting. There were definitely projects I didn't get because of certain associations I refused, Brosnan acknowledged. That's the price you pay for having a backbone in this business. But perhaps the heaviest toll has been psychological. The energy expended maintaining these grudges, the constant vigilance required to navigate industry events where enemies might be present, the careful calculation of every public statement to avoid revealing too much of his true feelings. As one longtime friend put it, Pierce carries these things with him. They're like weights he won't put down. And I sometimes wonder what he could have accomplished if he'd been able to let go. Yet, as Brosnan approaches his mid-70s, there are signs that the weight of these resentments has begun to shift. Not because he's forgiven his adversaries, but because he's finally reckoning with what these grudges have cost him and what they've revealed about his own character. Finding strength in vulnerability. Despite these lingering resentments, the Brosnan of today seems to have found a different kind of peace. Not through forgiveness, but through ownership of his own narrative. At 72, with a career spanning nearly 5 decades, Brosnan has achieved something many of his critics and rivals have not: longevity and relevance across generations of filmgoers. While some of his adversaries have faded from public view or damaged their own legacies, Brosnan has continued to evolve as an actor, taking risks in independent films while maintaining his commercial appeal. Time gives you perspective, Brosnan reflected recently. The things that once seemed so important, the slights, the criticisms, the politics, they fade. What remains is the work and the relationships that truly matter. For Brosnan, those relationships include his extraordinary 20-year marriage to Keely Shea Smith, his children, and the select colleagues who earned his trust and respect. Directors like Martin Campbell, who helped launch his Bond career with GoldenEye, and actors like Robin Williams, with whom he formed a genuine friendship on Mrs. Doubtfire, represent the positive connections that have sustained him. Perhaps most tellingly, when asked if he regrets any of these broken relationships, Brosnan offers that famous smile, the one that never quite reaches his eyes when the subject is uncomfortable, and says, "Regret is an indulgence I can't afford. I prefer gratitude for the journey, complicated as it's been." What's changed isn't Brosnan's willingness to forgive, the grudges remain intact, but rather his willingness to acknowledge them publicly. After decades of maintaining the polite fiction that all was well in Hollywood, Brosnan seems to have reached a point where authenticity matters more than appearance. "I've spent too much of my life worrying about how I'm perceived," he admitted in a recent interview. "At my age, there's something liberating about simply being honest about who you like and who you don't." This newfound candor represents not a hardening of Brosnan's position, but a softening of his need to maintain the perfect facade. The man who once felt compelled to hide his true feelings now seems comfortable letting the world see glimpses of his real self, grudges, resentments, and all. And there's power in that vulnerability, a different kind of strength than the one he projected as Bond. It's the strength of a man who no longer needs everyone to like him, who has made peace not with his enemies, but with his own reactions to them. As Brosnan himself puts it with characteristic understatement, "I'm too old now to pretend and frankly too tired." And that brings us to the end of our exploration of Pierce Brosnan's most challenging Hollywood relationships. From the fellow actors who criticized his work to the directors who dismissed his contributions, these stories reveal a different side to the man millions know only as the charming, unflappable star of stage and screen. What makes these revelations so fascinating isn't just the glimpse behind Hollywood's carefully constructed facade. It's the insight they provide into Brosnan himself. The man who endured an unstable childhood in Ireland, who lost his first wife to cancer, who reinvented himself multiple times throughout his career, is not a man who forgets either kindness or cruelty. As Brosnan himself puts it, every actor creates a persona, a version of themselves. The public comes to know the real person? That's a privilege reserved for the people you truly trust. These 6 names, Bean, Tarantino, Craig, Berry, Grant, and Gibson, represent more than just Hollywood feuds. They are windows into the soul of a man who, despite his legendary composure, harbors the same human capacity for hurt, betrayal, and righteous anger as the rest of us. He may never name them again in public, but now you know who they were, and maybe, just maybe, he wanted you to. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into Hollywood's hidden history, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Legacy News for more stories about the stars of yesterday and today. We're constantly researching the untold stories of your favorite actors, directors, and films, the truths behind the carefully crafted images. What do you think about these revelations? Has your perception of Pierce Brosnan changed? Are there other Hollywood relationships you'd like us to explore? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in our next